Hey there, students and teachers. Let's talk about the requirements for the AP Euro LEQ, the long essay question. I'm going to go through the rubric and the basic requirements. Now remember, I go more in depth in my 8-month writing clinic. For more information, you can click the card or the link in the description. On the AP exam, you're going to have 3 choices when it comes to the LEQ, and you will choose one of the 3. The first one comes from the so-called period 1, 1450 to 1648. The second will come from the so-called period 2 or 3, 1648 to 1914, and the third will come from the so-called period 3 or 4, somewhere between 1815 and the present. Now note here that topics from the period 1815 to 1914, the so-called period 3, will not be the subject of 2 prompts on the same exam. So, with that, you're going to have 3 choices, and 3 of the 4 historical periods will be represented. And note that the first period, 1450 to 1648, is the only period guaranteed to appear on the exam. So students with a strong grasp of the Renaissance and the Reformation could have an advantage here on the LEQ because that time frame will always be an option. There are 3 different prompt formats for the LEQ, all 3 of these expecting the student to complete a different task. We could have continuity and change over time, comparison, or causation. So it's important for students to understand that any of these 3 could be on there and each is requiring the student to complete a different task. Another thing to note is that all prompts in the 3 prompt set will use the same prompt format. So all 3 will either require continuity and change, comparison, or causation. These tasks will not be mixed up, and also remember that in advance of the exam, the student does not know which one of these tasks is going to be required. But it's important to understand all 3 because all 3 on the particular exam will be identical. Now, a disclaimer here. Exact prompt formats are subject to change, and the formats presented represent a combination of 1, what the College Board has released publicly, and 2, the best guesses of experienced AP European history readers. So we are trying to piece together the format, and we've seen a few different things, but this is my best guess, and I think it's, at least in spirit, it's going to be what we're going to see on the exam. But then again, I may have to re-record this video in a future year to reflect understandings from the 2018 AP European History reading. So first of all, the continuity and change over time prompt format. Evaluate the extent to which blank fostered change in blank from year to year. So, for example, it could be something like evaluate the extent to which the Reformation fostered change in Europe from 1517 to 1648. And that's going to require the student to go into how did the Reformation foster change in Europe. And of course, if you want complex understanding, to go into some sort of continuity as well. Comparison. The prompt format may be something like this. Evaluate the extent to which the blank and the blank were different from each other. So, for example, evaluate the extent to which the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance were different from each other. Causation. Evaluate the extent to which blank influenced or affected blank. So, for example, evaluate the extent to which humanism influenced Renaissance art. As far as organizing your essay, if it's a continuity and change essay, your essay will likely be based around 2 particular changes that are brought about. Now, as far as comparison, you would be outlining 2 differences between the things that are proposed, and for causation, you would evaluate that specific cause. And if you're going for complexity, which we'll discuss in a bit, you will bring into account 1 continuity, 1 similarity, or an additional cause or effect. So with that, let's go into the rubric, which is going to be only 1 rubric, not 4 rubrics. So those of you who have been teaching AP Euro for a little while, you remember the mess when we had 4 different rubrics for a few years. So all of these are going to be based on the same rubric. And so, for example, let's go from here going forward. Let's look at the prompt, a comparison prompt. Evaluate the extent to which the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance were different from each other. So paragraph 1, just like with the DBQ, your goal in paragraph 1 will be to score 2 points, getting the points for contextualization and thesis. For contextualization, you will be describing a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. And you are going to be really linking this to broader historical events, usually something right before or at the very beginning of the period, or it could be something alongside it going on somewhere else. And then you will go in with your thesis or claim, responding to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Now remember, the thesis must be located in one place, either in the introductory paragraph or the concluding paragraph. So if you hit it in the introduction, you're going to be fine. So as far as contextualization for this prompt, where you are comparing the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, some general Renaissance background with a few details will accomplish this task. So for example, Petrarch's discovery of Cicero's forgotten writings brought about a renewed interest in the classical writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The invention of the printing press led to widespread circulation of classical texts, which formed the foundation of humanistic education during the Renaissance. Specific approaches to humanism differed in Italy and Northern Europe. So now that I've contextualized, I'll be able to go into my thesis, which I should have already formulated by the time I've done my contextualization. Because if you haven't done your thesis, then you don't know where the contextualization is leading. We want the contextualization to lead to the thesis. So an example of a valid thesis here would be something like this. The Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance were different from each other because Italian humanists focused on the individual and on secular concerns, while Northern humanists focused on reforming society based on Christian principles. Both movements were similar because of their focus on classical studies. Now note here, what I've done here with the last sentence of the thesis is I'm trying to set up complex understanding. Now, if I'm not trying to get the complex understanding point, then the first sentence will be sufficient for credit for the thesis. So make sure here, I'm trying to show you how to get a 6 out of 6, but if you're just going for a basic 3 or 4 point LEQ, the first sentence is more than sufficient to get credit for the thesis. I'm just trying to set up here the complex understanding. So, 2 points in the first paragraph, 1 for contextualization, the other one for thesis. Next, we want to make sure that we have evidence and support for our argument. Now, for the first point here, you'll provide specific examples of evidence relevant to the topic of the prompt. And all you've got to do here is have 2 or more specific historical examples relevant to the prompt. And then there's the second point. Now, the second point, in order to earn this, the first point must be earned. You must have specific examples relevant to the prompt before you can use evidence to support an argument in response to the prompt using specific and relevant examples of evidence. So, the first point, the evidence is there. It is relevant to the topic. The second point is the evidence is there, relevant to the topic, and it supports the specific argument or claim that you're making in response to the prompt. A few notes on this. First of all, for evidence point number 1, all that's required is that 2 pieces of specific evidence relevant to the topic are present. Evidence should be adequately described using complete sentences, more than just what I call drive-by name dropping, okay? This isn't just mentioning something real quick and moving on, but showing that you actually understand this evidence that you're using. For evidence point number 2, the evidence used must support an argument. So if we're looking for evidence point number 1, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, which offered leadership advice to people aspiring to be effective rulers. Another example of evidence you could use would be in Utopia. Sir Thomas More created a society that was based on Christian principles where the inhabitants shared resources instead of hoarding wealth. For evidence point number 2, the evidence needs to be used to support a specific argument. So for example, I'm going to show you the topic sentence and then the piece of evidence used to support the claim. Northern Renaissance humanists were more concerned with using classical text in order to try to bring reforms to society using Christian principles. In Utopia, Sir Thomas More created a society that was based on Christian principles where the inhabitants shared resources instead of hoarding wealth. So the evidence here is used strategically to support the claim that is made in the topic sentence, which is 2-point evidence rather than 1-point evidence. Note here that there is no balancing requirement. Both pieces of evidence used can be used to support the same point. So you could have 2 pieces of evidence for the Northern Renaissance and no hard evidence to support anything from the Italian Renaissance and still technically earn the point. Now, I think that the strongest essays and the essay that you should write should have evidence to support both points, but strictly speaking, 2 pieces of evidence supporting the same thing could still get you this point. The next thing you need to make sure that you do is analysis and reasoning. Uses historical reasoning. Now this is where we bring in the comparison, causation, continuity, and change over time to frame or structure an argument that addresses the prompt. And so this way you're doing some type of comparison, causation, or noting the continuity or change over time. There is a link to a sample essay where I'll show you how to effectively do that, and you can see some examples. And then finally, demonstrates complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. Now, this is identical to the DBQ. There are several ways that you can earn this point, but for the LEQ, my best advice would be to focus on this, explaining both similarity and difference, both continuity and change, or multiple causes, or both causes and effects. I think that the best way to earn this point is going to be to do this on the LEQ. And so as far as that, for comparison, address a similarity in addition to the differences. That is, of course, what I'm doing here with the thesis, and I should also address that in my body paragraphs where I'm going beyond the differences and I'm also addressing a similarity. If this were a change over time prompt, address a continuity. So instead of just focusing on what changed, address something that continued from the beginning to the end of that period. And then finally, for causation, address multiple causes or an effect as well as a cause. Now, one thing I'm going to note is that the College Board has put out very few causation prompts, and causation prompts have never been on an actual exam that I know of since the redesign. So this is a little bit of an outlier, and hopefully in the coming years, we will have more information about causation prompts and better examples. So with that, remember that my subscription-based 8-month writing clinic is available. Click the card or click the link in the description. And for anybody who's interested in seeing a sample LEQ on the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, go ahead and click the card here or the link in the video description. And that is going to go from start to finish, showing you how to write an effective LEQ for comparison. And if you like that, you might think about subscribing to the writing clinic to get even more details on how to write DBQs and LEQs effectively. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. It is always a pleasure.